We've all heard it before, that before the Civil War, America was split into two completely different worlds, a modern, industrial, progressive North and an old-fashioned, agricultural, slaveholding South. But what if that neat story is mostly myth? What if the two regions, beneath all the shouting in politics, were far more alike than we care to admit? That's the argument that historian Edward Pessen made in his landmark article, How Different from Each Other Were the Antebellum North and South. And today, we're going to bust the biggest myths about life in the United States before the Civil War, one by one, using Pessen's own evidence to reveal a more complicated and more human reality. Myth number 1. The North and South were two separate civilizations. The story of two Americas, one free, one enslaved, grew powerful after the Civil War. It helped justify victory, shape memory, and simplify a messy past. But as Pessen points out, there was never one monolithic North, and there was never one South. Each region was diverse, geographically, socially, economically, and even within states, people's lives could look remarkably similar. The Mason-Dixon line divided political rhetoric, not two civilizations. Farmers, merchants, laborers, and elites across both regions shared the same dreams of independence, wealth, and respectability, and they operated within the same capitalist system. In short, before the Civil War, America wasn't two nations. It was one restless, unequal, and deeply interconnected society. Myth number 2. The South was agricultural, and the North was industrial. We imagine the North full of factories and railroads, and the South covered in plantations. But most Northerners and Southerners still made their living from farming. Yes, they grew different crops, wheat and corn in the North, cotton and tobacco in the South, but both were guided by the same logic of profit. Pessen writes that Northern farmers, just like planters, were money-minded, selling family land when prices were high and exhausting soil for short-term gain. The self-sufficient Yankee farmer was no more virtuous than the greedy planter. Both were entrepreneurs in a market economy. Even more striking, the North's booming textile industry depended on Southern cotton. New England mills, Northern shipping, and Wall Street banks were all bound to the slave economy. As Pessen bluntly put it, Northern public opinion accepted slavery, approved of doing business with those who controlled it, and abhorred its black victims. The economies were not opposites. They were partners in profit. Slavery fed the machines of the North, and Northern capital fed the fields of the South. Myth number 3. The South was backward, and the North was modern and capitalist. Older histories often describe the South as pre-capitalist or even feudal, but Pessen measures the Southern economy was as capitalist as any mill town in Massachusetts. Southern planters speculated in land and railroads, invested for profit, and followed the same market logic as Northern investors. They weren't medieval aristocrats, they were businessmen. Economist Gavin Wright summarized it well when he said, "Before the war, the South was wealthy, prosperous, expanding, and gaining economically at rates that compared favorably with the rest of the country. In other words, both regions were capitalist. They just relied on different labor forces to keep that capitalism running." Myth number 4. Slavery and free labor had more in common than you think. The reality is, there are some parallels, but an ocean of difference. This is where nuance and honesty matter most. Pessen noted some parallels between the exploitation of enslaved people in the South and wage laborers in the North. Both worked long hours, both saw their skills devalued by mechanization, both faced growing insecurity as industrial capitalism took shape. But let's be clear, these were not equivalent systems. Slavery was a system of total domination, of forced labor, inherited bondage, and racial violence. It stripped millions of their autonomy, family ties, and legal personhood. An enslaved person could be whipped, sold, or killed with little consequence for the enslaver. A Northern worker could quit his job. A Southern slave could not quit his master. To suggest they were the same would insult the lived horror of those held in bondage. And yet Pessen's insight is important. Both systems were part of the same economic order. They existed side by side in one national market, feeding the same banks, fueling the same industrial growth, and enriching the same class of elites. The cotton picked by enslaved hands in Mississippi was spun into cloth by underpaid girls in Lowell, Massachusetts. One system depended on ownership, the other on wages, but both reduced human beings to instruments of profit. The similarity wasn't moral, it was structural. And that's what made the antebellum United States such a contradiction, a nation preaching liberty while profiting from unfreedom. Myth number 5. The North was equal and the South hierarchical. The numbers tell a different story. By 1860, half of all free adult men in both regions owned less than 1% of the nation's wealth, while the richest 1% owned more than a quarter. That's astonishing. It means the pattern of inequality, not just in land but overall wealth, was nearly identical across the Mason-Dixon line. It means the pattern of inequality, not just in land but in overall wealth, was nearly identical across the Mason-Dixon line. In the North, industrialists and merchants controlled fortunes. In the South, planters did. Below them stood the middle ranks, shopkeepers, artisans, professionals, and below them the propertyless majority, factory laborers, tenant farmers, and the enslaved. Even when you remove the market value of enslaved people from Southern wealth, the inequality levels in North and South remain almost the same. Pessen concluded that the most striking feature of the evidence is how similarly wealth was distributed, or maldistributed, in the two sections. In both, power flowed upward, not outward. Myth number 6. The North was urban and moral. The South was rural and static. It's true the North had more cities, but the growth rates of urban areas in the South were impressive too. Charleston, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Nashville all expanded rapidly, serving as hubs of trade and culture. And just like northern cities, they were dominated by a small class of wealthy men who ran local politics, financed development, and kept labor cheap. Pessen found that the distribution of wealth in southern cities was nearly identical to that in northern ones. 2/3 to 3/4 of households in places like Houston or Stonington, Connecticut, owned no property at all. As for mobility, the myth of the self-made man dies quickly under scrutiny. Rich men in both regions were overwhelmingly born into wealth. Rags to riches stories made great political slogans, but statistically, they were almost non-existent. Most Americans lived and died in the same social class. Myth number 7. Democracy flourished in the North, and oligarchy ruled the South. On paper, both regions were democratic. White men could vote almost everywhere by the 1850s, but in practice, both were governed by oligarchies. In the South, planters dominated legislatures. In the North, industrialists and bankers influenced politics through money, media, and patronage. Ordinary citizens had the ballot, but not the power. As Pessen summed up, wealth, class, and power were inseparable in antebellum America. The plantation elite and the northern capitalist elite were two faces of the same ruling class. Myth number 8. The Civil War was a clash of opposites. The deeper truth is that the Civil War wasn't fought between two alien worlds, but was a struggle within a single civilization. Both sides were expansionist, capitalist, and hierarchical. Both believed in progress and profit, but they disagreed over who would benefit and whose labor would fuel that progress. The war came not because North and South were utterly different, but because they were too similar, competing versions of the same national vision that could no longer coexist. Myth number 9. Only the South was complicit in slavery. One of Pessen's biggest arguments is that the North's hands were far from clean. Northern banks insured slave property. Northern shipyards built the vessels that carried enslaved people and their products. And Northern consumers bought the cheap cotton that slavery made possible. As historian Leonard Richards showed, even Northern mobs attacked abolitionists to protect trade ties with the South. The institution of slavery may have been regional, but the profits were national. Myth number 10. America was a land of freedom before the war. Pessen ends with a sobering reminder. Inequality, dependence, and exploitation were American, not Southern. The Civil War did not destroy a feudal past. It exposed the contradictions of a capitalist democracy. The enslaved sought freedom, but free laborers still struggled for dignity. The South defended slavery, but the North defended profit. And in both regions, the promise of equality remained largely unfulfilled. So, what does this all mean? It means that before the Civil War, America wasn't a split personality. It was a single society, wrestling with the same forces: capitalism, inequality, and moral contradiction, expressed in different forms north and south of the Mason-Dixon line. When war finally did come, it wasn't just a fight between slavery and freedom. It was a battle over which version of that same unequal system would define the nation's future. The real myth isn't just that the North and South were opposites. The real myth is that the rest of us were ever innocent of the system that made both possible. Because as Edward Pessen showed, and as history keeps reminding us, the line that divided America wasn't just on the map, it ran straight through the American soil.